It's the SDG Podcast. Before we get started, you can check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com/podcast or find us on all the social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.
All right, this is the SDG Podcast. Say hello and introduce yourselves, podcasters.
I'm Els Tahura.
I'm Chad Jetner.
And I'm Peter Lawrence here today with our first tech podcast. And we are going to talk about something that is super important and not as exciting as we want it to be. And that's logging, right?
It's always the thing that you don't want to care about until there's an issue that you need to troubleshoot.
Yes.
Here's the thing, though. I feel like it's actually getting to be kind of exciting, right? Like we've got so many more tools these days to analyze and play with logs than we did when we were growing up.
Oh, yeah.
Or when we were kids or whatever, right? So it's not even like a dull subject really anymore like it used to be. Like it used to be, I mean, this conversation could be super, super boring. We could say, hey, what log level do you use for this? What log level do you do for that? Or whatever, right?
We use the right one.
Yes.
Why is it better today?
Well, we have like logs are just another data point now that we can use to do a whole lot of magical things with, right? Like obvious implications are like performance and analytics around what users are doing and what makes sense and you know what you as a team have to focus on. And I don't know, the tool set around that stuff is just kind of fun. It's interesting at the very least, instead of just, I'm going to log into a Unix box and tail the log and see what happens, right? That is incredibly boring.
That is very boring. Well, and the tools have gotten so much more amazing just to output a log where you want it to go, right? Like when we started, it was right to well, at least in my world, the .NET world, it was right to a file in a location and then maybe IIS would have some logging that would help you also, but really you're spitting out the important things to a text file on a web server, and then you're going to go tail that file and look for things that you want, right? But now there's so many different ways to aggregate these log files or this log information, right? It's not just files. It's not even files anymore, really.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, sometimes your tools kind of bite you in the butt. Thanks, Log4j. What was the joke? Somebody posted a joke on our internal Slack channel that said, you know, system out print line would never do this to you, which for Java is how you spit something directly to the console. Like,
well, yeah,
it was system out print line would never do you like that.
Printf debugging always works, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think it is a problem if your CIO or your COO knows the name of your logging framework. That's never a good thing.
Yes.
And asks you about it. But I think the one and only ever security incident with Log4j far outweighs the benefits that we get from using a tool like that to help us write stuff.
Well,
It far outweighs it?
What else would you use?
Incident in like 2 decades.
Right.
Okay, so you mean the revert. You're not saying that the incident far outweighed the benefits. You're saying the benefits still outweigh.
Oh gosh, yes. Goodness,
Okay.
yes. Thank you, Elle. That is, yeah.
That's a controversial position to take on a logging podcast.
No, gosh. No. Goodness. I for sure said that wrong. No, it's like the utility that we get out of something like that, so much so that it's almost like Kleenex, right? When I think of on my side of the fence, Peter, when I think of logging,
Mine too.
I think of Log4j, you think of Log4net.
Yep.
And what those tools allow us to do is pretty, it's so great that it's kind of boring, right?
And even when I'm using another platform, I do a search for what's the Log4j equivalent in this particular TypeScript environment. All right.
Yeah.
This is a great library. Cool. Done. Somebody's ported this already.
Right.
And
So
usually it's Amazon, right? Or Apache.
So really quick, like there's some obvious things that we care about when it comes to logging, but
Well, yeah, let's start with basics.
Yeah, there's the basics. Like well, I'm able to troubleshoot my production instance if I have good logs, right? And it's easy on my side of the world, right? The Java world. Mostly I'm just looking for stack traces, and it's formatted kind of nice where you can stare at it almost like you're staring at, the output of the matrix, right? Where there's the green symbols flowing down from the screen. I can stare at a screen and I know when I see a stack trace, I'm like, uh-oh, that's almost never a great thing, right?
No,
And
never.
if you see a stack trace and you think, oh my gosh, wonderful. Well, you're a weirdo.
You're doing it wrong.
Yeah, you're absolutely doing it wrong.
You're using the log to log stack traces in the wrong instance. Those are in the bad instance, not the good one, right?
Yeah, exactly. But like outside of troubleshooting production or dev environment issues, Peter and Elle, what do you in today's world, is there anything new or interesting that you guys are doing with logs that you wouldn't have expected 20 years ago?
I won't say that I'm doing anything unexpected, but I am definitely I was thinking about this morning also, that when I start a project now, logging is sort of one of the first things I think about these days, right? And back 20 years ago, logging was, oh, we're having problems in production, we should put some logging in to track that down, right? Now I've got a robust logging framework that I can turn a knob and get more details just with a simple configuration setting, or turn it down where it's just quietly not logging anything because I haven't asked it to, because I haven't turned the knob up to log everything or log, a lot of detail, right? And those are just like the step forward for that is just amazing, right? It's such a simple concept. And certainly we've all built that into our if production or if dev, do this, and if not, do that, right?
Yeah.
But nowadays it's just it's built in, and it's more of a forethought because you're going to need it later on. Maybe that's just me getting older. I don't know, but
no, but I think that speaks to just, you've had those experiences where okay, if I treat this as an afterthought, everyone will suffer.
Right. Yeah,
I would say for
patches out there. I'm putting patches out there to get logging, not to get features.
Yeah. For me, on being on the data side, I would say one of the things that I've seen happen a lot more frequently over the years is just sharing and making logs accessible by other teams. And just that it's not something that, okay, these are our secret logs and I'm going to hoard them like Gollum, because if anybody else sees them, then they'll have, I don't know, some insight into how I code wrong, or
how badly I did this one thing and I'm really embarrassed by it, but it's in the logs, but that's okay because
so just seeing either, okay, are there dashboards where we can integrate different logs together to, like Chad, like you said, have a more holistic picture of how an application is functioning, or even just in incident response, having a lot more openness about, all right, we have 3 people in 3 different areas of an application where we're experiencing a problem. We're going to start sharing our logs together so that we can correlate events, and more holistically create a fix. Like that data sharing seems to be something that's more prevalent within teams, just in terms of behaviors, but also, the tech is better so that it is easier to do that in the first place.
And that almost brings us right to aggregators, right? Like Splunk and Datadog and
the Elk Stack.
Elk Stack, yeah.
Elk Stack.
I love that stuff. And what I've noticed lately is, like, when I'm writing code, I actually write my logging statements a little bit differently these days because of the tools on the other end of the spectrum, right? Like, I always try to make sure that when I'm spitting out something, it's almost in more of a machine readable format, right? Like, I don't just use like natural English like I did when I started. I'm like, okay, almost like a JSON type format, right? Like, user : and then a ID, and then like a thing that and I'm an old school Perl guy, right? So like a thing that I would be able to easily pull out of the log if I was using Perl with common separators, common everything.
Right.
I write things that way nowadays because I know the other side of this is going to be something like Datadog or the Elk Stack or something where I'm going to want to say, here's all my logging, here's all my messages. Gosh, I wish the guy that wrote these in the first place would have made this a little easier for me to write some sort of report on. And that's what these things do. They allow you to put like pretty graphs and pretty reports on top of your logs so that you can find, and this is the use case where it's not necessarily just troubleshooting. This is like, here's performance metrics, here's here's this, and here's
user counts. How many users do we have on simultaneously, right?
Yeah, like how many users do we have on? How's the app performing? Are there slow performing SQL queries somewhere, like on the other side, like where I'm thinking more specifically of like app development logs, but on the SQL side, right? Like we spit out SQL logs now that say, here's your slow queries, right? Here's this, here's that. And then now we have the ability to take all of these things and put them in one dashboard and say, hey, this user did this thing, this SQL query performed poorly, and it caused the application to do this. Like, I don't know that even 15 years ago, you probably could have done that, but it would have been a lot of work.
No, you would have spent more time doing that than developing the application, and therefore nobody did it, right? Because it just wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
And you counted number of users some other way. You kept track of it in a database or something like that. Elle, do you find like people are expecting more from, tell me which queries are slow or tell me this or that? Like,
yeah,
they're almost demanding like, hey, help me fix my app and make it better, right?
Yes, and what's even better is when we have the logging set up so that if they're testing in your UAT or pre-prod environment, you can maybe start to catch some of those ahead of time. And so before it goes to prod, you can see, like, even when we're working on a much smaller user base, this is a terrible idea to run this. So, but yeah, there is a lot more, I would say a lot more communication, a lot more interest in improving performance, just as we see with applications. Like, anytime you're making it slower for your users to do something, more likely you are that you're going to lose them or they're not going to do the action that you'd like them to do. So yeah, I think that's definitely helped communication a lot and making apps better too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think of like the most basic use case for writing reports on top of logs. Like 25 years ago, you build a website, you would have some silly tool that you probably spent too much money on, look at your access log and say, here's the pages that people like, right?
Right.
And that would literally be all you got. This IP address hit this page this many times, right? And if you just think of like how that evolved from what it was in the late 90s to what it is in 2022, I mean, just look at Google Analytics, right? Like Google Analytics kind of started there. But now it's like, here's where they went. Here's how much time they spent there. Here's like what town they live in. It's actually kind of creepy, actually. And yeah, that's not necessarily a logging thing, but that's where a lot of, when I put logs out there for an enterprise application that I built, that's kind of my true north. Like that's where I'm like, okay, let's not necessarily get to that level of detail, but that's what's possible with this stuff. And you apply the explosion of that to enterprise application performance metrics, all that analytic stuff that you can do. I'm trying to think.
You've got more fingers, but you just can't think.
I know.
Do you log differently for external applications versus internal process? Like, we're just moving some data over from team A to team B, or transforming data as we prep it for displaying it on an application.
I would say in the past for sure, because troubleshooting for your internal folks is probably a little easier. You can actually do the work from, your system and repeat their process or their problems. But external people, you can't call up IP address. Hey, I'd like to talk to you about your web experience today. Can you tell me what you did wrong when you were using it and made it blow up?
Yeah,
it just doesn't happen.
I know that, like, I mean, there's for external folks, for internal folks, I'm a little more like less. I don't want to say this the wrong way and get in trouble, but like, I'm more comfortable logging. I'm not going to log passwords and credit card numbers, right? Because it's an internal application. You don't necessarily have that data. But I might actually put a little bit more in the logs for an internal user than I would for like a publicly facing site that I don't want to necessarily have. I don't want to have private data in my logs for a publicly facing
PII
site.
and things like that are much more concerning now with logs than they were back in the 90s, right?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. But I do kind of want to be able to say, this is a person out there, like have some way of tagging a user and saying, hey, this UUID is having, this issue, so that, if I had an issue that I needed to address, I'd be able to say, in a tool like Kibana or whatever else downstream, I'd be able to tie those into metrics that I could track and see how often, okay, here's a unique user, here's their experience in the app, here's another unique user having a similar experience. Now we can tie all that stuff together and build kind of a profile of what's going on. And I've done that before. And it's just, I'm so happy that we have so many freaking tools out there at our disposal that we don't have to write ourselves. I remember having to write these parsers on my own, and we don't have to do that anymore. And it's great.
So with that, no, go ahead, Peter.
Or to log into a database, into a formalized structure that you'd be like, all right, timestamp this column, this column, this column, and then miscellaneous. And hopefully miscellaneous doesn't get too big because you'll never find it there, right? Because the SQL won't be able to pull it back out of there. But
you just make it like an nvarchar max and just wait until that throws an error. Or the one I like even more is when you just say, okay, give me the first 4,000 characters so that we know it won't ever go past nvarchar max, but have fun with those incomplete messages. I was just going to ask Chad, since you brought up PII, how much in terms of, okay, let's make sure we don't have PII or sensitive information or, our server passwords or anything in our logs, how much of that is done as part of a regular code review, and how much is done by, let's say, a crawler you might have who's just like monitoring the logs to potentially detect what might be sensitive information?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that almost 100% of that would happen in a code review, right? Okay. And if it gets to the point, if for me it gets to the point where I have to rely on a crawler, I'm like, that's a problem. I have been in situations before where like we want to get an ISO certification for all of our processes and everything else, right? Like a compliance audit. And that's really mostly like, are you logging, right? Not what are you logging? They just want to make sure that you're logging access. They want to make sure you're logging, a couple of key things, mostly access, who's hitting what, when, why, that stuff. I wouldn't rely on a crawler to parse that information out. But usually what I do is like, if we're logging anything externally, just tie it to a session ID. Like that's my UUID for an external user is we have a J session ID on my side, Peter, and I'm sure you've got what?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's all we're going to log. I would actually be tickled if somebody logged a credit card number, like just to try to sneak it by us, like it'd be fun to see that in the code review and be able to ask a guy, hey man, were you kidding? Or do we have to have a very different conversation?
Right. One conversation that we're not talking about that that would have been talked about in the 90s and 2000s is, well, what's logging going to do to the performance of our app, right?
Yes.
Oh my, we can't log anything because we'll slow down our app so much.
Like it'll block the app. Yeah.
Yeah. There are cases probably where logging did block an app.
Oh, that's
sure.
That's actually, I mean, it's a good observation, and it's still I wouldn't say it's necessarily a problem, but I will admit to having been bit by that, just because we had a log go nuts, fill up a disk, and oops, that's the only thing I care about these days is like, if you're still logging, like you said early on, Peter, if you're still logging to a file for whatever reason and not just spitting it out to a tool like CloudWatch logs or anything else, that's the only reason to like kind of control it. But I don't know. I mean, that's not my preferred. That's not my go-to anymore.
No.
It's always pushing to a tool, and disk
and you just
space
don't think about it anymore, right? It just
no.
You'd like, I'm going to log this because it's important. I'm going to set the logging level to an appropriate for the environment that it's going to be in, and I'm not going to log every single query parameter or something like that from my entity framework that, from every entity that I generate, I'm not going to log the query that it generates because I don't need that in production. But, maybe in some of the lower environments, I'd like to see it just to see what they're doing.
That's a great question. I mean, this gets into like old school talks about logs is what do you log at what level, right? And most folks know we got, critical, error, info, trace, blah, blah, blah. Debug, yeah. And I just kind of pick three usually, right? Like I don't get too pedantic about saying,
no,
this is, boy, what's the difference between debug and trace?
Right.
I mean, come on.
Don't care. Pick one.
In Log4j, they are two different things, I think, still.
Sure.
But in real life, like, nah, I don't care. I don't really, I mean, and nobody's really going to, I don't think anymore, and maybe I'm wrong, nobody's going to really use those differently, but.
Not those two, no. But I mean, you're going to use info and debug or trace, whatever you want to call it. You've got your low level, your medium, and then your, oh my gosh, something went wrong. I will get a stack trace from this one.
Yeah. But for me, it's like on the simplest level, it's info is, hey, this guy logged in. Cool.
Right.
That's an info thing. Critical is, the app's not going to work unless you address these things. And trace is like database statements. If I was going to do that, that's debug/trace. And that's as simple as you could possibly make it, I think. But now I know like dark corners of most of the applications I write. I try to put some stuff at the trace level that I could say, and in my world, I can say, hey, I only want trace level logging for this package structure, right? Like anything that falls under this, let me see all the trace logs. And I'll put like performance metrics in there, right? Like I might not log those by default to info, but that's a trace thing. And then we can graph that if we need to, if there's a problem, if there's trends that are,
right?
Yep.
Turn the dial to trace and away we go.
Yeah. And just the fact that we have dials these days that we don't have to restart our applications to.
Yes.
I don't know when that changed, or if I was just doing it wrong for a very long time. But the ability to live tune, adjust your antenna accordingly in a production application is such a nice convenience that I can't even. Yeah, it's just nice.
I've absolutely
can't live without it. Can't believe you did.
Yes. Yeah. Because I've absolutely been in a position where application is running slowly and we know it's something with the database and I have some database logs, but hey, let's start seeing what the Hibernate queries actually look like. Like, oh, that's why it was a cross join. Thanks, Hibernate.
Yeah. All the different tools and all the things that you take for granted sometimes, right? And if nobody looks at it soon enough, it makes it to production. But with logging, you can find it, which is a big change from ancient times.
Yeah. And also, I can't believe I'm saying that these days, but they're actually, like, if you've got the output of all this stuff set up properly, like a nice Grafana dashboard that pulls in logs from all sorts of things, it's actually kind of pretty to look at and a little bit mesmerizing, right? To see all this stuff. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just weird, but that stuff actually is kind of.
It is really nice. And I also think it can give the team insight into how well an app is functioning, when sometimes we don't necessarily get to see the positive impact. Like, that's a way of saying, look, we did this, it's functioning, people are doing what we want them to do,
Right.
as opposed to only hearing when the house is on fire.
Yeah, that's the other side, right? Like, oh, I've got problems because I'm getting phone calls and tickets in my inbox. Oh no. Versus, there's nothing in my inbox, it must be fine. Not, it could be better, or anything like that.
Or maybe somebody has a bunch of emails in their inbox, they just don't know my name yet, so I haven't heard about it. So just, and be able to, and hopefully being able to use that logging to catch things proactively, so you don't have to wait until a customer calls in upset. Yeah.
Hey, Peter, can we talk about logging nightmares really quick? Because you just triggered something in my brain.
We should talk about logging nightmares.
Do you have one in mind? I have one in mind.
I've got one that I will relay after yours.
Okay,
we'll see who the.
One of our guys thought it would be. This is a couple of years ago. Fella said, "Hey, I think it would be awesome if we just got email notifications whenever something super bad happened." Right?
Sure.
And on the surface, it seemed like a really nice idea. But he implemented it at the wrong level. So literally every single log, like, we got, woke up the next, he implemented it. It went into production. We didn't really think about it as much as we should have. And then we got, I don't know, like 200,000 email messages.
Right.
The next morning.
Did you break your email server, or not quite that bad?
I won't. So we were hosted on Google Apps, or whatever they call it these days.
Sure.
Right.
Yep. On cloud. So you didn't suffer too badly.
We didn't. Well, we filled up our email boxes for sure. We had to pay a little bit more that month for storage, but it was a kind of a comical, like, why didn't we think about this before? Like.
When the five of us were testing it, we didn't have any of these problems because we only got 5 email messages, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those situations where it's like, oh yeah, we should actually get notified, but maybe you kind of tune that a little bit better and really understand what you're signing up for.
Maybe every 200 messages will get notified, and then we'll know we have a really big problem because it's times 200, not 200,000 in your inbox right away.
Exactly. All right, what's yours?
My logging nightmare was, so how do you guarantee that your logs are going to get delivered, right? I need to know that all my logs are going to be captured, and they are, I will not miss a log statement, an important log message that I need to have. So what do? Well, you use, in this case, MSMQ, right? So you use a queue service to guarantee delivery, right? Queues are great for guaranteed delivery. They don't guarantee when, they don't necessarily guarantee order. They do more nowadays, but in the past, they guaranteed delivery. They didn't say timely delivery. They didn't say, full service delivery or instantaneous delivery. And so every server that existed had a queue and would dump all the messages into that. And then those queues would aggregate into another queue. And eventually, we hit kind of the same roadblock that your email box hit, right? We ran out of space or ran out of storage, or things weren't going fast enough. So now the logs are a minute behind, 5 minutes behind, 10 minutes behind. Oh my gosh, they're a day behind. I guess we'll restart everything, throw away a day's worth of messages or whatever happens to be sitting in there, and start it up again. Okay, well, this is going well. Oh, now we're 5 minutes behind. Now we're 10 minutes behind. And the solution, sadly, was, well, we'll just restart those things more often. So we'd only lose 10 minutes of messages instead of days worth of messages. But, obviously, eventually it'll get rewritten and probably use one of the fancy aggregators that are out there now. But back in the day, when you wanted guaranteed delivery, you turned to a queue, even though it didn't necessarily perform as well back then either. So
yeah.
And you just those things you don't even think about anymore, right? I don't even think about, oh, well, what if my logging gets backlogged? I don't think about that. It doesn't even cross my mind. I just know it's going to be there.
Same, right? Like, I don't worry about the logs filling up my disk space anymore, like I used to have to. I don't worry about writing cron jobs to clean up log files.
To go out and look at log files or clear out 3 months ago's log files because,
because
space.
Modern stacks have evolved way past that.
Right.
I'm sure some poor kid is at the beginning of his career and probably still doing that. But
I've been at clients that are, and so for me, I don't necessarily have like a single horror story. I have been at clients that have a different type of logging for every system or every team, and none of those logs play well together. Or instances where, the team might be working on very old school setup. So for example, they're using older versions of SQL Server and leveraging the default logging that you get with your database jobs. And that log has a absurdly tiny character limit. And so you run into cases where, I'm going to have to guess what the error was because I only caught the first 2,000 characters of when it crapped the bed.
And it told me it was really bad, but it didn't get to the part that was bad. It just told me in a lot of characters that it's really bad.
Yeah. We're trying to think of how do I correctly capture useful logging information when system A calls system B, but system B fails.
Right.
Because there have been, so I think one of my favorite examples is like, running a SSIS package that runs a PowerShell script. The number of times I've seen a failure or an email that just says, in executing this PowerShell script, we got 0 when we expected 1.
Oh, that does not seem useful.
No.
If you need a Rosetta Stone to understand your log messages, you probably run into an anti-pattern.
Yes.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
100%.
And sometimes you just take the resulting output and expect like, oh, this PowerShell will give me useful output if it fails or if it succeeds. And not necessarily.
That's one of the main things is that, and Al brings up a great point, like never make too many assumptions with, once it leaves your world, I will likely, again, back to the levels at a trace level, say, hey, this thing is leaving my world. I'll let you know when it comes back, when it re-enters orbit, I'll log when it leaves orbit, when it comes back, and if there's an error with somebody else's thing, that's what I always worry about. Like, I'm relatively confident in my work, and super, I don't want to say untrusting, but that's the best word.
Experienced.
Yeah.
There you go.
It's reasonable doubt.
Exactly. I have reasonable doubt about other folks' stuff, right? So I just want to be able to have forensics available to me when something like that happens. And that is logs, right? Logs are your forensics for everything. Otherwise,
Well, and I mean, a lot of times you're not building anything else, right? You're building things on top of your logs rather than building, nobody builds a dashboard from scratch and feeds it specialized data anymore, right? I mean, back in the day, you would feed these like, oh, we need a dashboard. Okay, I will write specialized data out to this location, and build
Yeah,
a dashboard off
each
of that.
dashboard has piles of custom transformations and
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. So now the dashboard comes off of logs or logging of some sort. It may not be your logs, might be the system logs, but they're built off of logs because logging is ubiquitous.
And when we talk about delivering products to customers instead of, what anything else, for me, this is part of the product, right? A well-reasoned framework around this stuff and a consistent pattern to it across everything is part of my product. Like, I want to make sure that whatever, we go into clients and they have different tool sets for different things.
Yep.
I want to make sure that whatever I'm delivering works beautifully with their tool chain. And at the end of the day, all of my experience, all of like a request leaving my orbit and re-entering the atmosphere, that's a thing that we can track. And that's part of the product that I deliver is reasonable analytics around everything going on. Really good forensics when you need it, and you will.
Right. Yeah.
Especially if your app is highly dependent on integrations across the universe, you need forensics.
I feel like Hello World still needs forensics at some points in time.
Exactly.
Like just to prove Hello World is a forensic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, maybe some level of reportable metrics, whether that's all based on one application, or if it's metrics around that you kind of build off of every part of your application, your
Right.
back end, your front end, your database, your queues, all of that stuff. The ability to tie all that stuff together into a reasonable dashboard is part of my product that I put out at the end of the day, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Which makes sense, because I think that goes into I know each of us, I'm sure, have heard the stat or whatever, and I can't remember the specifics, but just, X giant percentage of our jobs are working with someone else's code. And so the more that we can make our code analyzable and maintainable, that is making the job easier for whoever is going to be working with it next, because that's just the reality of our jobs. Somebody else is going to touch it.
Yeah.
Right. And as consultants, we get to walk out the door, right?
True.
At the end of the day. And even if I can read the hieroglyphics that somebody else wrote, it's still better to clean it up and write a good, reasonable log message that somebody can actually read and figure out, oh, when I see this message in this particular line of code, I know that this failure happened. And now I'm going to go look at that system for the failure, not the current system that I'm looking at, right? Because it's outside.
Yeah. And again, I get back to it. Like, if you need to leave when you walk out the door, if you need to leave them a Rosetta Stone to say, hey, here's how you interpret everything that I put out there.
Right.
We probably didn't do a great job.
A 372 means that Google is down right now.
Yeah.
And while that's useful information, it might be simpler these days to just write, hey, Google appears to be down.
Yeah, exactly. That was, we don't necessarily have character limitations anymore. We can use the whole spectrum. I mean, I think we can log emojis if we wanted to, which would be hilarious, but don't do that.
That comes back to the Rosetta Stone idea.
Yeah, it would actually be kind of funny. I mean, terminals these days can't actually, I'm still kind of a terminal guy. I like it.
Sure.
And I get delighted. I use Brew quite a bit, and this is a divergence from the topic, but I use Brew quite a bit, and they get the little, the beer emoji when it's doing something, and I'm like, oh my gosh, those guys are clever. And I think it'd be hilarious if I just saw like the little devil emoji when something bad was about to happen, and I was tailing a log like you shouldn't do anymore.
That's right. Right. So, Ellen, your data world, have they caught up? Is logging caught up yet? Do they log everything?
I would say it is extremely dependent on how your a particular data team is set up. So, for example, in clients that I've worked with where we have more what I would just call like programming based ETL and database maintenance, the logging is fantastic because it just it ties, it can pull so heavily from web development, application development, and just leverage those advances. In areas where the data work tends to be more using more GUI based interfaces,
SSIS and things like that.
Then the logging tends to be either absent, which is great, or just very sparse and customized. And so there are absolutely plenty of times as a consultant when I am having to worry about this job has 6 years of logs on our server and now the drive is full, and so now we have to build in processes to delete the last 3 years of logs daily. So that is absolutely still a thing. It's going away, and that's something where the increased adoption of cloud is really, in my opinion, like that is really what is driving more data teams to have what I'd say more modern logging practices.
Sure.
It's just easier.
Yeah, it is. And back in the day with we'll call, trying to think of a non-derogatory term for the DBA that kept everything internal to their desk and would never let any of that information out. They didn't want logging because then somebody else could come in and maybe figure out that their 4-hour job that they spend 4 hours on really is 4 seconds of starting it and 4 seconds of looking to make sure that it finished correctly. Or whatever. Right.
That fear of obsolescence.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, but they're built, so the tools sound like they're getting there. They're getting there in the data space, which is nice.
Yeah. It's they're absolutely are significantly better than 10, 15, 20 plus years ago for sure. But I would say from what I'm seeing in my client places, there's still work to be done, which is fun.
Because there's still the letters ETL, right?
Exactly. Although, man, the amount of time that people spend debating ETL versus ELT and like, well, it's just performance and let's just do what works best for you. That it's not that you have to pledge allegiance to a particular acronym.
Right.
But I think one thing that I'm curious, Peter or Chad, if you run into, is something that I've seen come up a lot when we have discussions about, okay, let's actually have better logging. Let's use a framework and start to integrate across different applications, different systems. There can be concern typically from higher up saying, well, we got to be careful that we're not locked into a vendor. What have you experienced that, and like how do you have that conversation? Because
I don't know that, specific to logging, I don't know that I really had, because it's relatively generic. The output is relatively generic, and that's I think the vendor lock-in comes at the end of it where you got all these consumers of the logs, right? And usually, for my world, and I think this holds for Peter's as well, is that the implementation is usually obfuscated for us. Like we're going to dump to a thing, and I just as general as that thing can be, the more general that thing can be, the better.
Yeah.
And then there's probably a little wiring up to an actual implementation, an actual vendor at the end of the rainbow.
Yeah.
But for logging, I don't necessarily think that I've been locked into a specific vendor. And even if I was, I don't know that I would do too much different, right? Like I'm more concerned with crafting meaningful messages that I output somewhere. And I always think of that somewhere as a very, very abstract implementation of a something.
Right. And as we saw in December, right, Log4j is pretty pretty far spread, right?
Right, exactly.
There are a lot of people concerned all of a sudden
And it
about
was
certain things.
Yeah, that one for me, it was like, and the Log4j incident is bigger than this conversation because it's more of a how do you handle open source dependencies? Because for us,
Right.
like we're like, oh, we
Yep.
just upgrade a version.
Right.
But then we have to go and deep dive into all of our dependencies, and you got to traverse your dependency tree and figure out, oh, okay, how do I get a version of this that uses that, or can I force this version here? Oh gosh, it was.
Have they updated yet? And can I pull them in or not? Or do I have to wait? Or are they on it?
Yeah, it was an
Yeah.
incredibly tense half hour for me, and then I
Yes.
was like, oh, this actually isn't that big of a deal. I don't have to worry about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it depends on the situation, right? If you're writing internal apps and things like that are strictly internal, you may not necessarily have to worry about the 0 day immediately because, that means security has failed so many other places to get to your app. You still worry about it, obviously, but you don't necessarily go into firefighting mode and we need to change everything right now and get it pushed out immediately.
Yeah.
No, not really.
Peter, I think we made logging actually interesting.
I've been entertained.
I have too.
So
I'm legit surprised that it actually turned into an interesting topic.
I think with that we'll throw it over to the end, right?
L, wait. Parting thoughts. L.
Ooh.
Logging is essential. Think about it when you're starting, not when you're ending. And try to leverage existing technologies where as much as you can. Like logging is not something where you should have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter,
Never.
what are your parting thoughts?
My parting thoughts are very, very similar to L's. Like, start with logging. Never, ever put logging in or delay logging, right? Like, oh, we should do logging. As soon as somebody says that, do logging, right? The instant that comes up. And make your messages meaningful, not just to yourself, not just to your small team of developers right today, but write your messages so that future you will thank you for being specific about what's going on.
Right. And I would just like clarify so mine is just to kind of build on what you just said. Write machine parsable logs, right? Like
Yeah.
write logs in a way that a Perl guy or whoever is going to be needing them is going to be able to write some sort of report.
The AI parser will come through and just clean
go.
house and grab it all up, right?
Yeah. So that's my big thing is think about that. And then the second thing is actually talk about it at the start of a project. Get everybody on the same page as to what that means so that you have a consistent strategy, you have a consistency there that you don't need to go back and refactor later.
Well, and to your point, Chad, that it's helpful to get everybody on the same page because then you can understand how it is useful for more than just failures, like just using it as a metrics source.
Yeah. It's not a thing that you just pull out during catastrophes. It's a thing that you kind of review on a cadence.
Yep.
Yeah.
Part of a working agreement, right, of your team should include, in a code review, I'm able to throw that back to someone because there's no logging.
Exactly.
There should be, right?
Yep. Perfect.
So I think that wraps it up pretty nicely. Thanks, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye.
So long, fellas.
Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group. Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.